And as you know, a coin has more than two sides. Actually, it has infinite sides. There's the face and the other side, and also the round side. So keep it in mind when you are evaluating what you have seen. The same kind of traumas that the kids were talking about and the psychologist was doing the research of on the Palestinian side, there is the same also on the Israeli side, kids that were exposed to a decade or more of rocket barrages constantly from Gaza Strip. So just keep it in mind. I don't want to elaborate on that. Even that will be part of discussing the security needs of Israel. So, based on what you have seen before, and again, I apologize, I don't have slides, I don't have anything, so you'll have to bear with me on this one. So, if you're looking at the map that you have seen before, okay, Israel is actually like an island, but instead of being surrounded by sea only on one side. All the rest is sea of countries that at least some of them are still enemies, others were perceived as enemies. I'm excluding Jordan and Egypt at this point in time that we have a peace agreement with. And that is also needs to take some kind of qualifying statement. For instance, Egypt, even though now it is ruled by General Sisi, and there is a very good collaboration between General Sisi and his Egypt and Israel on on defense issues. Just a few months ago, less than a year ago, the Muslim brothers with Morsi were ruling there, and their aim was to annihilate Israel through a proxy, but still that was the basic approach that they were taking. So, still, even though there is a peace agreement, which is well kept now, and there is a cooperation in the level of security and defense issues, because the Egyptians are facing enormous problems from terrorist groups, Islamic extreme terrorist groups in Sinai. So there is a lot of cooperation, including agreements of Israel to let Egypt bring in much more troops and armors and helicopters and so on into the Gaza Strip against what is written in the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Okay? But still, need to keep an eye. And not only that, the same Islamic terrorist groups that are now being chased by General Sisi and his forces, their aim was actually to go after Israel. So that actually looks at a little bit on the southernmost border or side of the border, which is the calmest and the quietest, if you will, almost, so to say. Going a little bit further north, but still on the south, you have the Gaza Strip. As you could understand, the Gaza Strip is, based on what we heard earlier, is besieged. Nothing comes in, nothing can go out. Well, I guess that one would beg to differ from that. Again, just a few facts. During the last engagement, when about 100 or so rockets were shot from Gaza to Israel, and Israel was retaliating to defend itself, at the same time, about 100 18-wheeler lorries were going into Gaza every day with supplies. Nobody probably either knows it. Oh, here's Rabbi David. Okay. I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yes, Emmanuel.
I'm handing it over to you. I've done enough damage so far.
You've done a lot of damage, but thank you for doing that. So tell me when I can start speaking, and Yuval, can you see me on the screen there?
Yep. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Good. You're on.
I'm on. Great. So first of all, I want to welcome everybody for coming to this talk, and I really want to thank Herb Rothschild from Peace House for inviting Ayala to give her presentation this morning, and for inviting us to give this presentation this afternoon. This is obviously a very important topic, Israel's legitimate security needs, and it's absolutely impossible to do in the short time that I will have with you. I do want to introduce you to my friend Elan Raveh, who is an Israeli-American, and he's a licensed tour guide in Israel. And a tour guide is a very interesting position. It's comparable to getting a master's degree. It's a 2-year postgraduate degree. It's very, very intense training to work with people of all political perspectives and every religion. So anyway, I just want to welcome you. I want to thank you, and I also want to thank my friend Emmanuel Ben David, who spoke to you before, and he'll be answering a good deal of the questions that we may not be able to get to. But if you have questions, please do, I don't know, raise your hand and maybe come to the computer and speak. We might have time for a few questions. So here's where I'd like to start. I could see the group, but how many of you did see the film previously, this Occupation 101? Could you please raise your hand? So a bunch of you did. So I just want to take 1 minute to speak about that. The film was very disturbing to me. It was not like a two-sided, fair presentation. And I just want to say it's very important when we're listening to or watching videos, really not to believe anything, not to believe me or Emmanuel or Elan or certainly that video. You have to do your own research. There's so much misinformation going on in our world today, as we all know. That film was so flawed, it would really take me an hour just on that film to show you how flawed it was in terms of half-truths, misinformation, and outright deceptive presentation of facts. And just as, for example, one simple example of what's called a half-truth is that they mentioned that there were wars between Israel and Arabs, but they omitted a very simple fact, like in 1948 and then 1967, that these wars came because Arab nations decided to invade and attack Israel. That's kind of an important fact, but that was omitted. So when you just say that there's a war between two peoples, it sounds like there's equal responsibility. There really isn't. Since its inception in 1947 and the beginning of the State of Israel, Israel has always supported the idea of a two-state solution. Right in 1947, 1948, the Jewish Agency proposed through the United Nations, proposed through the Jewish Agency the idea of two states for two people. So that is what's on the table today. But to get to two states for two people, we have to come through a gauntlet of issues, and one of them is really Israel's legitimate security needs. So that's what I'll try to address in a very, very brief amount of time, and then I'm going to present you to Elan, who will give you not a different perspective, but will complement what I'm telling you now. So I want to talk to you directionally, and I want to talk to you geographically. If I had a map in front of you, I would show you roughly the Middle East is the size of the United States. And roughly Israel is literally the size of Kentucky or New Jersey. So if you can imagine Kentucky in the middle of the United States, you really have the perspective of the average Israeli. They're not just looking at the perspective of their relationship to the Palestinians. They realize, of course, they have a much more powerful army, a much more powerful air force, a much more economically developed nation. But an Israeli sees his and herself in the context to the Middle East. And you have four directions, of course. And I just want to share with you the difficulty in understanding Israel's security needs. It sounds like they make such a big deal. Security, we'll work that out, no problem. It is a problem because, for example, let's just take the South. It's really actually the Southwest would be the nation of Egypt. A wonderful country, but obviously has going through its own issues. Mubarak, for example, was a dictator. But this dictator, Mubarak, who suppressed his own people, was against Islamic extremism, and he suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. So then there was the Arab Spring, and there was all this hope for possibly democracy in Egypt, let's say, or Libya. And of course, the Egyptian people elected a representative from the Muslim Brotherhood. And what Morsi, the new president, immediately did is started suppressing freedoms of of the Egyptian people, and a special oppression to the Coptic Christians who were living there. And it was really a mess, and the Muslim Brotherhood was starting to come into the Sinai Peninsula and presented a great and present danger to Israel itself. So there was an army coup, and a dictator named al-Sisi takes over, and immediately he suppresses the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is not good news for the people of Egypt, of course, but in a sense it was oddly okay from a political, military point of view, a security point of view for Israel, because the fear is not the Egyptians. Fear is not the people of Egypt. The fear is the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic extremism that would like to overthrow the government of Israel. That's their clear and stated policy. It's not my opinion. But please double check me when you go home. Just check the Muslim Brotherhood and see what they're really all about. Yeah, please. Elon wants to add.
So I wanted to interject that when the election was happening, when first the Arab Spring was happening, and also when the more recent election that first brought Morsi into power and now has ousted Morsi was going on, I was in Israel, and I think coming from growing up in America, valuing democracy, I was telling my Israeli friends, you know, this is really amazing what's going on in Egypt. That they're having democratic elections, that this person is being democratically elected. And I think one of the things that they said to me back then, I didn't really understand, I do understand better now, is that the election of somebody through a democratic process can often not necessarily be a step forward, especially for progressive values in the Middle East. And in the situation of Morsi, you know, the people that are my friends, Israeli folks who grew up in this region, were doubly, I think, nervous. Firstly, they were nervous because Morsi was oppressive, but also the Muslim Brotherhood has stated very clearly in various written manifestos and platforms that they have published that they are that they call for the destruction of Israel, that they call for the destruction of the Jewish people. And having somebody like that as the democratically elected leader of a country that is not across the world, right? Egypt shares a border with Israel, and not only does Egypt share a border with Israel, but Egypt and Israel are the two countries that border the Gaza Strip, right? And the Gaza Strip, especially when you talk about the conflict and talk about what ends up putting Israel in the news a lot of times, the Gaza Strip is one of those very volatile areas. And I think for a lot of Israelis, it's a very, very nerve-wracking and concerning prospect, having Morsi elected and having Morsi be a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, thank you, Alon, for clarifying that. And of course, I just have too many Israeli friends, and I know their hope is for a really, truly free and democratic Egypt that's not controlled by people who want to create theocracy. So please study that. Study the Muslim Brotherhood. You'll also understand Hamas a little bit more, who are ruling the Gaza Strip, because Hamas is, you might call it a local franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood right on the border of Israel. So then you have the question of, let's say, that's from the south. And remember, because of time limitations, I'm giving a talk tonight in a local church here in Virginia. I'm doing this so briefly. You know, it's almost unfair to what I'm trying to share. So that, let's say, is the issue of the south. Let's move to the east. Excuse me, let's move to the west, the Mediterranean Sea. So Israel has this blockade, and you wonder, well, it's so unhumanitarian to have a blockade. But then we have to understand, again, please let me remind you of the context. Israel is such a small nation, the size of Kentucky, in the Middle East, which is the size of the United States. So from the west comes ships, and these ships are coming down from Syria, they're coming down from Turkey, and guess what's on those ships? Yes, sometimes medical aid and supplies and good building supplies that would go right into Gaza. But the problem, along with those good building supplies, as we saw this summer in the tragic battle in Gaza, was all this concrete that was used to build tunnels that went underneath Israel into kibbutzim, settlements and villages that were in Israel, not in contested territory, not in the West Bank. To the west is this beautiful Mediterranean Sea, but ships are also coming in carrying missiles and rockets and ammunition that come into Gaza. So, in other words, there's no direct enemy, you might say, but the security needs of Israel, it must protect its shoreline, you know, against the ships that are coming in, bringing in all these armaments are not coming from the sky and dropped in and by helicopters, they're coming in from the sea on the west. So covering that's 2 directions. Let's go up to the north.
Do you mind if I?
No, please. Yeah, this is great. Thank
And
you.
one thing I want to interject about that is that a thing that is important to know is that a lot of Palestinians make money off of fishing. That Palestinians are, not entirely, but there's a good portion of the people who live in Gaza who make money off of fishing. And to say that Israel blockades the sea 100% would be a misnomer, because there are still hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian fishing boats going out into the water and fishing daily. Obviously, during times like this summer, there are sometimes interruptions within that because of the conflict. But it is a misnomer to say that Palestinians have this beautiful coastline and don't have access to it. It is, I think, fair to say that Israel legitimately, because of what you said, Rabbi Zaslow, wants to monitor that border and can't make it someplace that is freely managed by Gaza.
Thank you. Israel has absolutely no interest in an oppressed Palestinian people. Absolutely no interest. They're self-interest. From a selfish point of view, Israel has a self-interest in peaceful relationships with its neighbors, especially our cousins, the cousins who are indigenous to that land, just like the Jewish people are indigenous to that land, the Christians who live there, the Druze who live there, the Mormons who recently moved there, the Baha'i who live there, the Muslims who live there. So anyway, that's just a philosophical overview. So let me just go back to security, and now let me move to the north. In the north, we have a tragic situation, which is Lebanon, and Lebanon has been semi-occupied by Syria in a very, very serious way. And as we know what's going on with President Assad, he is not a Muslim extremist. He is simply a despotic ruler, a dictator who has, as we know, as the United Nations knows, has killed over 200,000 people of his own people, Christians, Muslims alike, who would be challenging his government in any way to bring any kind of Arab Spring to the north. The problem with Syria is that they're close tied. They are supported both economically and militarily by another country that we cannot ignore, and this is the country of Iran. So a lot of us in America, especially those of us in Ashland who really want peace, think, what's the big deal with Iran? Just, don't get so paranoid about them. But they are, in present day, they are the largest exporter of terrorism in the world. They are supporting Hezbollah in the north, which is, as I said, has a virtual lock in Lebanon. They're supporting the extremists in Syria, and they support also financially and militarily Hamas. So we have a serious threat coming from Iran that comes from the north as well as coming from the west. So, for example, the northern border of Israel is called the Golan Heights. You could call that occupied territory, but these heights are so necessary for Israel's security that imagine if a few years ago they had given that land back to Syria, their security would really definitely be shaken. Wouldn't you agree with that a lot?
Yeah, I think another thing that is important to point out here, we were talking about this yesterday, David, was the idea that there's a lot of remnants of colonialism in the Middle East, and Lebanon is probably the worst scar of that. There's a number of different straight lines. We were talking about this yesterday, how you can see where the British were or where the French were because of the straight lines that were kind of drawn with rulers by colonial leaders. But Lebanon is really an example of Christians, Muslims, Druze, a number of different Middle Eastern minorities that are squished together because of the way that the lines were drawn. So the country itself does not have enough of a national character or enough strength as a unified nation to really keep Nasrallah and Hezbollah, that terrorist organization, at bay. And I think that's one of the reasons that at least the northern border, the one between Israel and Lebanon, is so critical to defend. I think the other thing that's important to say is that when you talk about threats that are on paper, that are consistently levied against Israel, the biggest threats that are coming, that are clearly said against Israel are by Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, who says Gaza has hundreds of rockets that they're sending to you. We at Hezbollah in Lebanon have not begun to send to you the tens of thousands of rockets that we have that we can shoot at you. And it is one of the reasons that, that is like Rabbi Zaslow said, that they are directly connected with Iran and a puppet of Syria. And because of that, the entirety of the north of Israel is really a precarious place.
Thank you, Alon, once again, really for giving that perspective. I cannot emphasize to you enough that a lot of us in America think, what's the big deal? Why does Israel make such a big deal out of security? And again, we keep this in context of a small nation surrounded by the possibility of extremisms of one sort or another, whether it's a secular extremism by Assad or whether it's an Islamic extremism like Hezbollah and Hamas. These folks are not fooling around. In 1998, Emmanuel, I know you're listening, I don't know if you know this, but in 1998 I went to Gaza with a delegation of 23 Jews on a project called Compassionate Listening. And I met with the founder of Hamas. His name is, what's his name? What's that? Sheikh Yassin, Ahmed Yassin. Ahmed Yassin was very clear. There was no political duplicity about him like a normal politician, Israeli politician or an American politician. He wasn't kidding around. He said, look, you people, the Jews can live here, but they can never be two states. It is in not just our charter, but it's in our theological point of view. So I want us to understand the theological underpinnings of some of this conflict that leads to the security issues is that the theologically far right-wing, what we're calling Islamism or Islamist extremism, they're really seriously not wanting ever a two-state solution. And every time Israel came close to a two-state solution, they would send out terrorist groups, there would be some bombing, and it would scare the life out of the Israeli public. So, that's the North. Oh, go ahead, Elad.
Well, I wanted to interject that I think that, so there's these real religious underpinnings, but I think that when you ask the average Gazan or the average Palestinian, I don't know that they would connect them quite as much. And I think one of the things that's important to know is that the extremism, the religious extremism that we tend to cite so often is not necessarily something that the people who are the average Palestinian are as connected to. And I think one of the things that they are very connected to, and one of the big tragedies of Gaza especially, but also the West Bank, is the economic depression. And that's one of the things that for me, like a movement like BDS, like Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, that really tries to attack or tries to fix a moral harm in Israel, will cause actually more harm for the Palestinians. An example of that is like a very, very clear like vilification of the occupation was this vilification of SodaStream, right? SodaStream is an organization, a company that created a really successful product, and they, the factory where they were creating this carbonation product was in the West Bank, and it employed hundreds of folks from the West Bank, hundreds of Palestinians, who were making relatively quite a bit more money than they would have made had they been employed by a Palestinian business in Ramallah or in East Jerusalem. These folks were getting healthcare, they were getting a living wage. Because of the way that a half-truth about, listen, I think that the questionability about, the questionable nature of building an Israeli company on Palestinian land is something that should be debated. But the bottom line, and I think specifically the bottom line for these Palestinians, was they were making money in a way that was comparable or was livable in Palestine. And because BDS's pressure, at least in part, caused them to move that factory, those Palestinians are out of work now.
Right. So I'm going to hold us back to the issue of the security issue, because it's such a big issue.
Those people are now Hamas terrorists, right?
Yeah.
They don't have a way to bring money home, but Hamas will come to them and say, listen, if you come and you are a martyr for us, we will take care of your family, and that's what they do. You know?
I see. Thank you. So let me move over to the east. Of course, I'm sure you know, because you've seen the maps, Palestine was never a nation per se. It was what's called a mandate. The term Palestine came from the Romans because the country was called Judea in the North Israel. They didn't want to give it Judea means the Jewish land. So they changed the name to Philistines, Palestine. Exactly. And so the Palestinian mandate after the end of the British occupation included Jordan. Jordan is no ancient nation of Jordan. It was an ancient nation of Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, of course, but Jordan was really created out of whole cloth. So here's the security issue coming from the east, is that the Hashemite kingdom that planted, at the end of the British colonial rule, that planted somebody from, today would be Saudi Arabia, into controlling this area called called East Palestine, the country of Jordan, placed these kings in there. Today we have this we call him a moderate, a king. He's made peace with Israel. King Hussein, he's one of the good guys, so to speak. As far as non-democratic monarchies go, let's just give him the benefit of the doubt and call it a somewhat benevolent monarchy. But the problem is that the population, and I can't get the exact figure because I keep hearing 60 to 70% of the Jordanian population are ethnically Palestinian. So the great fear that King Hussein has to deal with is that he has a threatened regime. In other words, if that regime were to be taken over by Palestinians, you say, well, it's not bad because they're 70% of the population. And I would agree with that theoretically. But if it became under the control of a Hezbollah or control of Hamas, particularly, or of Islamic extremists, then we have this issue where to the east of Israel, the country bordering it so close, because it shares the Jordan River, could be potentially controlled by an Islamic extremist group. It sounds far-fetched maybe to us. It's not far-fetched to King Hussein. King Hussein knows that the most direct threat to his regime at this particular point is actually not ISIS, it's not Iraq, it's not Syria, but is the possibility of him being overthrown by potentially an extremist group who are Palestinians. So what would happen? What's the big deal, you might say? So if Jordan became a Palestinian country, theoretically, no big deal. But here is the big deal. They would completely, potentially, cut off the water supply from the Jordan River into Israel. Now, so one of the things, and this is where I kind of want to finish, because I want to see if anybody has any questions. We've got 10 minutes, and unfortunately we have to sign off. Emmanuel Ben David will carry on a little bit for us. But here's the issue. Whether you're Likud, conservative, or whether you're liberal in Israel, the reality of these security concerns, as I've outlined them, are pretty much borne out by most Israeli citizens. Wouldn't you agree, Alon? It's not a left or right issue. Whether they re-elect Bibi Netanyahu, that's a liberal or conservative issue. That's up to them. They're Israelis, they'll have their own free elections and elect who they will. But the security concerns are everybody's concerns. The Arab Israelis, the Christian Israelis, the Druze Israelis, the Jewish Israelis from all over. Why is the concern over the Jordan River such a big deal? So Bibi Netanyahu happened to have stated many times that he would support a two-state solution under two conditions. And these two conditions, which address directly the security concerns of Israel, are completely unacceptable to the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas. They're absolutely, of course, unacceptable to Hamas. A two-state solution is unacceptable by Hamas. Please don't believe me about that. Go online tonight, Google Hamas charter, right? Just look at the charter of Hamas and see what they have in writing and what they believe in. So here's the issue in the Jordan, and here's what, let's say, the government of Israel has stated. The first issue is that to have a Palestinian state, it would have to be demilitarized. Because once it's not a police force is fine. The Israeli police and Palestinian police have always really gotten along quite well in the exchange of information. But the issue is having a military. There's very, very serious concern both in Labor and Likud, liberal and conservative, about a two-state solution. The second one, which is even more controversial, is that the Rift Valley, the Jordan Valley, which is the highland coming over from Jordan, looking down upon this valley going into Israel per se, the government has said there would be this 2 or 3 mile strip all along the Jordan Valley, called the Rift Valley. And this 2 or 3 mile strip would be demilitarized and under the watchful eye of the Israeli army for a period of 50 years. Why? For that very fear that I was speaking of before, in the event of an extremist group taking over Jordan, that Israel would be able to protect its eastern border. So, Ilana, I don't know if you have any other words, but I just want to say if anybody has a question there, I think we can address 1 or 2 questions. I think you should probably go either to the microphone or you should probably go right now up to your computer, where whatever your IT person says there. Ilan, you want to say anything about Jordan?
No, I think we should leave as much time as possible for questions. I can give a little wrap up afterwards. Does anybody have any questions?
Great. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, I do.
Please, ask it good and loud, please.
I'll come over to the computer. You can see my ugly face, if you will.
Please.
Would it not make more sense to have a United Nations along the Rift Valley than it would to have an Israeli army, or which would be resistant by the Palestinians?
I think theoretically, from my point of view, absolutely. But the problem is that we've seen what the United Nations has been unable to do in almost every previous conflict that it sent its armies. Well-meaningly, it sends its armies in, but the armies are not willing to fight and die for a cause against a very aggressive army.
I was going to say that's the macro experience, and the micro experience is that Israel in the previous wars, right, in the war in 1948, 1967, and 1973, all three of those bigger, more formalized conflicts, they were all ended by the UN, and they were all ended through some sort of truce or ceasefire that often called for UN management of the demilitarized zone. An example of both 1967 and 1973, those were examples of times that the UN was monitoring and then was kicked out, I think in both situations, by Egypt. I think ultimately what you said, though, David, that the UN doesn't have teeth is the concern here.
Right. The military teeth. It has, let's say, moral teeth, but not the military teeth. Very good question. I think we could do a couple more questions. If people kind of line up to the microphone really quickly, we can address your questions. And I know Emmanuel will do much better than me and poor Elon racing through this, doing the best we can. You answer the question. Gee, we've done great. Now raise your hand if you totally agree with everything that we said.
One last question. I'd like to hear you say something about the place of the settlements in the West Bank. We heard a lot about them in the movie. I'm going to wait for Emmanuel to speak to that, because the settlements are not really what you might call directly a security issue. Obviously, the West Bank is its whole issue in itself. Going back to biblical times, the West Bank was simply called Judea. It was the heartland of Judaism. So the right wing, let's say, so to speak, in Israel really believes it has a right to build these settlements. The left wing doesn't believe it does. And that's an issue that's up for negotiation. Clearly, I recommend the book by Clinton's chief negotiator named Dennis Ross. It's called The Missing Peace, P-E-A-C-E, and he speaks about the settlement issue in really great detail. Not trying to whitewash it in any way, but the reality is that in a negotiated settlement, 97% of that land that we call the West Bank can be negotiated, and the rest of it can be done through compensation. So the settlements are really not the great impediment to peace. Those are the many of us that do not believe in settlement building. Some of us do believe in it. That's a separate issue. It's not really so much a security issue. It will be negotiated out. And just read Dennis Ross's book, The Missing Piece. He was Clinton's negotiator, left-of-center guy. Really a great description on how Arafat really blew it in 2000, because they would have had 97, 98% of the land, and the other 3% through compensation and additional land.
I want to interject that if you don't want to read the entirety of the book, although you should, the Wikipedia articles around the Oslo Peace Accords, Oslo I and Oslo II, will confirm what David just told you about more than 95% of the issues at odds between the Palestinian Authority and Israel are settled. And because they are settled, it's really about making sure that both sides can come to the table and have legitimacy. And I think that's really the larger impediment here. You know, it is having somebody on both sides that is legitimized by their populations and can come broker peace. That's what's missing.
Right, and then just from an Israeli-centric point of view, the security issues have to be addressed by Mahmoud Abbas. As I said, Israel is demanding a demilitarized Palestinian state, which can seem humiliating to them, but they want to use the models such as Switzerland and Japan, which are demilitarized. And secondarily, having this 2 or 3 mile strip along the Jordan River to protect against their eastern border. Very important issues to the Israelis, and we have to see how it's going to, the settlements, how it's going to come out in negotiations.
I wanted to ask a question, David. This is her. I'm glad to hear you speak so confidently about Israel's willingness to have a two-state solution.
Thank you.
And I hope you're right. I don't think the historical record is nearly as clear, and I don't think that and I think there's a lot in the history of Zionism that suggests otherwise, and the continued push to build settlements in the West Bank belies that. And then most recently, Netanyahu said he is not willing to cede any land for peace. And over again, Israel, along with the United States, have been one of the 3 or 4 countries that have opposed UN General Assemblies, like Resolution 242. So I'm a little skeptical of the assertion, but I really hope that you're right.
Thank you, Herb. I just want to cut you off because I have to leave literally, we have to leave in 2 minutes here. But listen, all I could tell you, I could be wrong, okay? But my hand on the Bible, and from my heart, I'm telling you, everything I know about every Israeli policy through the 20th century, and let alone 1947, 1948, is that Israel at every juncture was willing to have a 2-state solution. The joke that Dennis Ross, I believe, made about Arafat in 2000 with Ehud Barak was that they just can't take yes for an answer. It was a corrupt regime, the PLO. They couldn't take yes for an answer. Even today, there can be a 2-state solution. I'm not talking about the rhetoric of politicians on the left or the right, but the reality is that 85% of the Israeli public will accept a 2-state solution under the conditions that Israel's security is seen as paramount. And I think I'm going to let Ilan close it. But before I do that, I want to thank you, Herb, for the question.
Thank you.
I wanted to parse out what Netanyahu said, Herb, specifically, because when Netanyahu said he won't cede any land for peace, he is still speaking within the terms of Oslo. Because when he says he doesn't want to cede any land for peace, he means that there will be land swaps to cover all of the Israeli settlements that are taking land away from the West Bank, would take land away from a potential sovereign Palestinian state. Those pieces of land, that geographic area, will be compensated to the Palestinians and will be given to them in a different spot around the West Bank, that would be cutting into Israel's mainland. That's just specifically about that issue. And then I wanted to say one quick thing about just kind of a concluding bit about Israel and the security situation, which is that I think it's important to keep in mind that Israel is the only country in the world where both men and women are conscripted at the age of 18 into the army, and that the country doesn't want its young people who are, should be going to college, should be becoming adults, enjoying life. They don't want them to be soldiers. They don't want their citizens to have that be the first experience they have outside of childhood. But they see that as a necessity. And I think that that when we think about the threats and when we think about the conflict, we have to keep in mind that the distance that America has, geographic distance, geographic safety from this religious extremism is an important and very, very salient reason why Israel's actions sometimes are things that we don't understand necessarily from an American perspective. I think that after 9/11 happened, there was a lot of things that we did that were very extreme because we experienced a terrorist attack on American soil. We need to keep in mind that Israel experiences those much more regularly.
Thank you, Ilan. So once again, we have a Hebrew word, misubach. Whenever you're talking about an issue like this, we have to say misubach. It's complicated. Please, everybody, I beg you, we could only do so much in 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Emmanuel will be with you for a few minutes. He can only do so much. Please study this, not from an op-ed piece, but go on Wikipedia, go online, and really take a look at the Israel security needs. Just Google Israel security needs and study it from both sides and make up an intelligent response. The second thing I want to do is urge you all to go there, because when you go there, you get a very different perspective. There are places in Israel, Allah has you literally see Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt in one eyesight. They're hills. The country is so small, it's really that even when there is going to be, and I want to just say this maybe in conclusion, when there will be a Palestinian state, Israel's neck, so to speak, will only be 10 miles wide. That's Ashland to Method. That's the width of the whole country. Right now, the width of the country in that area is 40 miles, Ashland to Grants Pass. size matters, and it's so small, and that's the pressure that they feel they're under, from the south, from the north, from the east, from the west. So with that, I think I really want to thank Herb Rothschild, because I think it was sort of gutsy, if that's the right word, or courageous for you to invite Emmanuel to speak, and Ayala this morning. So, Emmanuel, are you still there, or did you walk out on us?
No. I'm here.
Okay.
We're going to go into what we like to pay.
Are you prepared to clean up the mess we made for you, Emmanuel? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you so much,
right.
David. Thank you. I think that